Kia ora, I'm Chelsea Daniels, and this is The Front Page, a daily podcast presented by the New Zealand Herald. Consumer NZ expects power prices to increase by about 5% this year. It's after households were already hit with a 12% increase to power bills last year. But what does that all mean? Will it make winter that much colder? Will we have to cut back on groceries? Will people be able to afford the increase? Today on The Front Page, Consumer NZ's Powerswitch manager Paul Fuge is with us to break down why power companies pass on steep network hikes and what households can do. So, Paul, tell me about Consumer NZ's price predictions for power.
Yeah, we believe we're going to see an increase this year of around 5%. It could be higher or lower depending on where you live, which retailer you're with and which location you're in. We have seen some price notifications come through from our members indicating around 8% in some cases. So yeah, but on average, we're predicting around 5%. And this is bad news because last year, 2025, we saw increases of 12%. So this is more pain for electricity consumers.
How do you kind of work out these price predictions?
So what we can see is through Powerswitch, we can see changes in the prices, and we get notified by retailers of when price changes are imminent. But we also know from notifications from lines companies and the Commerce Commission of expected price rises for the regulated part of the power bill, that's the lines charges.
In terms of the lines charges, are they kind of set at a price for a number of years, or are they inevitably always going to get higher and higher?
That's correct. They're set by the Commerce Commission because lines businesses are monopolies. So the Commerce Commission runs a pretty fine ruler over those. And those prices or those price paths are set in 5-year periods. So the current price path was set from 2025 to 2030. So we're now in the second year of that regulatory period. And unfortunately, lines costs have increased since the last regulatory period considerably. And those are things like, the interest rates, the cost of finance, the cost of equipment, and the impacts of climate change. So lines prices have increased considerably, and that's being reflected in those regulated prices.
Why are there, though, these fixed delivery costs climbing while you've got, high hydro lake levels lowering wholesale prices for electricity? Why can't they just balance them out a bit?
That is a very good question, and that's what we believe, that the energy prices should be offsetting those increases in lines prices, because we have seen a lot of fuel come into the system. It's been very wet. Hydro lakes are full to the point of, they're having to spill water now. So that should be offsetting the cost of the increase in lines charges, and that's not happening. And that's due to the way that our market's working or not working, as we keep saying. And that needs to be looked at as to why in a country with such a predominance of renewable energy, low-cost renewable energy, why our prices keep climbing.
Well, why aren't retailers passing on those savings to customers? Is it simply because they like money and they don't have to?
Well, retailers are buying electricity on the wholesale market, okay? And prices in the wholesale market reflect the risk of what's called a dry year. So New Zealand's really lucky in that we have a highly renewable system, sort of 80 to 90% renewable, and those are low cost, which is great. But renewable energy is subject to the vagaries of weather. So occasionally we get what's known as a dry year. And in a dry year, we don't get enough fuel for our system. Mainly sort of the hydro lakes don't get filled up enough. And that means we get a spike in prices in a dry year. So the risk of a dry year is there all the time. So even in periods where we seem to have plenty of fuel, plenty of water, the risk that a dry year could occur is reflected in the price of electricity all the time, particularly in the forward markets. So retailers have to buy electricity for consumption now, but also they're buying hedges for the future. And that risk of a dry year, which seems to occur by the Olympics every 4 years, we seem to get a dry year, is there all the time. And so that's why even when we seem to have lots of water, we're still paying high prices because of that wholesale market.
Right, so it's not completely unreasonable then. They're kind of squirreling some stuff away for a rainy day, or a not so rainy day rather, hey?
Yeah, it's just a function of the way that our market has been set up and the mechanisms that have been put in place. So what we've been saying for a long time is we want to change that dynamic. We need to change some of those market settings if we want to get the price of electricity down. And we need to get the price of electricity down because it's causing real harm to consumers and now the broader New Zealand economy.
Well, speaking of harm, I know that your research shows 1 in 5 Kiwis went to bed early or skipped heating last winter, and nearly 1 in 5 cut food or essentials to pay for bills. Could this get worse this year?
Well, very much, because that was last year when the prices increased. The prices increase again. We'll see more people falling into that hardship bucket. And that's the real story here, is that, we've always had energy hardship, but that's growing. And so increasing numbers of New Zealand households are struggling to pay their power bill, and that will get worse. And that has real consequences for, social cohesion, health and well-being, but also the broader New Zealand economy. An estimate of high energy prices is costing our economy about $5.2 billion in terms of our GDP effects. So this is getting really serious. It's got to a point now where something needs to be done, because if we keep seeing high prices, it's really going to affect, households even more, and also our wider economy.
So what should be done? If you had the ability to do something tomorrow without any barriers, what would you do first?
Well, this is a really big question, and the government has, you'll be aware, there's been many, many reports, many inquiries. It's a very complex thing, but at its core, the electricity market isn't functioning like it was supposed to, and that was what needs to be fixed. So we believe in the power of markets, a consumer in New Zealand. A well-functioning market will deliver, innovation, keep a lid on prices, and choice for consumers. And these are good things. But these are not outcomes we're seeing from the electricity market. So, the electricity market came into place, the retail residential electricity market came into place about 25 years ago. So prices today are 60% higher than they were at the beginning of the market. So something's gone wrong there. But also, if you look at the other outcomes in terms of consumer choice, 3 retail brands left the market last year, so we're getting less choice. 90% of consumers, roughly, are with one of the 4 large gentailers or one of their subsidiary brands. So it's not a market that consumers are particularly interested in or engaged with, or particularly working for them, as you'd expect. But also investment. So it's highly profitable. These gentailers making large profits, and there's nothing wrong with making profits. We'll make that clear. It would be worried if they weren't making profits. But what we're concerned about is enough of those profits being reinvested into new generation, and we don't believe that the investment has been keeping pace. To keep a lid on those prices. So the market structure currently rewards scarcity. So generations are arriving a little bit late rather than a little bit early all the time. And that's generating, really high prices. Another interesting statistic is, 80% of New Zealand's generation capacity was built before the market came into existence. So most of our generation is actually quite old, and it's all working really well, and that's not a bad thing. But also that if you look at our fleet of generation being highly renewable, even though the gas and the fossil fuel element only contributes about 10% of our generation in New Zealand, so that's the large gas and coal-fired electricity plant, it still set the price of electricity 70 to 90% of the time. Okay, so even though we've got a low-cost renewable base, our price is predominantly being set by high-cost, fossil fuel plant.
Why is that?
Because the way that our market has been structured to work is that the way that they dispatch electricity in New Zealand and the way they set the price is the highest priced generator sets the price. And gas is doing that 70, 90% of the time, and that sets the price for all generation. And so that's the mechanism that's causing these high prices. So if you really wanted to change the price of electricity, these are the sorts of things that need to be looked at, these mechanisms that clearly are delivering these high prices.
In short, LNG will help keep the lights on while we build more wind, solar, hydro and geothermal. It is a critical investment at a time where declining gas production has forced some of our businesses to cut output or close, hurting regional economies and costing good-paying jobs. Affordable and abundant energy is something that as a country we should have in our basis to be able to drive our economy, and that's why we are taking this step.
In terms of gas, though, I know that the government Energy Minister Simon Watts made an announcement the other day about a construction of a $1 billion plus gas import terminal in Taranaki. Obviously, it's going to take a bit to build, but will that alleviate any concerns in terms of price?
We don't believe so. We understand what the government is trying to do here and alleviate that dry year risk I talked about. We think there are cheaper ways of doing that. We applaud them for addressing this issue. This is a long-standing issue, the dry year risk. We don't believe LNG is the best way to address that. We believe there's better alternatives than that. It's quite expensive. The government's own advice, from the Frontier report was not a great option. So we would sort of say this probably won't reduce the price of electricity. When it's not guaranteed that it will reduce the price of electricity, it is guaranteed that the cost of this will be borne by electricity, consumers. So we would need to see more detail of how they came to that conclusion, but we don't believe it's a good thing for consumers.
Where would you spend that $1 billion? What would be a better option? Because I understand that at Mercury, for example, I heard the CEO there speak to Heather du Plessis-Allen on her show last night on News Talk ZB.
Why'd you guys decide not to do it?
For us, it's really making sure that we've got multiple solutions in place to support the resilience of the grid for New Zealanders. And so at the time, we were investigating a number of those options. One of those is to keep building power plants as fast as we can, which we're doing. The other was with the Huntly firming option. So for us, we felt we'd explored a number of those options and had some of them in train already.
But if you've got a whole bunch of people saying, look, this isn't the best option, it's going to cost you about double, you're better off spending your money elsewhere, it will be really interesting, won't it, to see into the books and see how they came to that conclusion ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, what we don't like about it is it's inequitable. So it's the charges are being passed on to electricity consumers, for gas. It's high cost, so it's about double the cost of renewables using electricity via LNG. But also, it messes with our, energy sovereignty. So we're 100%, self-generating electricity here. We don't have to import fuels for electricity. And so as soon as you start doing that, you're tied to the international price of gas, right? So, if you get wars overseas or, and the gas price spikes, that's going to be reflected in the price of electricity here. So it's quite risky from that point of view as well. So if you want to spend $1 billion, there's other things that you could have done or can still do that we believe would be better. One of our comparative advantages in New Zealand is we are energy rich. We've got, we're very lucky. We've got lots of potential for low cost renewable energy. That's what we should be focusing on. If you look at something I'm a big fan of, which is rooftop solar. That's probably the lowest cost way to make electricity at the moment. So if you look at my own system, the calculations I've done, the cost of producing electricity with my own electricity system on my roof, even with financing costs, is between 12 and 15 cents per kilowatt hour. Now that's much lower than I'm buying it from the grid, right? That's quite low. And even better than that, I'm selling it back to the grid at 17 cents per kilowatt hour. So, there's huge potential there. So New Zealand's only got around 3 to 4% penetration of solar, domestic solar, compared to Australia, which is closer to 35 to 40%, right? Even places like Germany, 17%, even the United States, sort of 67%. Even Ireland has got more, solar penetration than New Zealand. So there's this really low-cost solution available to New Zealand, and we're really well suited to it. So, imagine if we spend $1 billion on promoting domestic solar. It would have much better outcomes for consumers and much better outcomes for New Zealand's energy sovereignty.
Well, from memory, Australia actually offered subsidies for people to get solar panels on their roofs at one stage, hey? maybe a couple of decades ago and now.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of research into this. I'm not diving into it now, but it's a really fascinating topic that I'm really I'm really passionate about. As are others, but yeah, because it is such a good thing for consumers and for the environment, and not least of all, it's the least cost way to do it, right? You can actually lower your household energy costs if you can do this. So the problem is access to capital. People being able to access the sort of $10,000 to $15,000 you need to build a system. But it's great to see a lot of banks offering interest-free loans now. And other schemes are being looked at, so that's really positive. So, overseas they've incentivized people through subsidies and other types of incentives. We think those should be looked at here, because once you get a critical mass, that's when it takes off under its own steam, right? So once people are walking around the streets and they see, the neighbours have got solar and it becomes really normalised, that's when it really takes off. And we haven't quite reached that threshold yet. So in Australia, it'd be odd not to have. If you walk around the neighbourhoods there, it's you notice the houses that haven't got solar, whereas here it's the opposite way around. It's the people with solar are in the minority. As soon as you turn that on its head, it develops its own steam and people start doing it. But we believe it needs some sort of subsidy or intervention or some sort of incentive to get that critical mass going.
And there is no real good reason for why New Zealand has to be in this situation. A country like ours, which is blessed with incredible natural resources, should have abundant, affordable energy. The previous government's misguided decision to ban oil and gas exploration, together with a target of 100% renewable energy by 2030, and the Lake Onslow proposal, had a chilling effect on investment in energy projects. A consequence of those decisions is that New Zealand has faced major energy supply risks in recent years. A shortage of energy supply pushes up power prices for New Zealand households and businesses. That, of course, came to bear in 2024 when New Zealand experienced a dry winter. Severe shortages at that time pushed our electricity prices so high that they were amongst the most expensive in the Western world.
If we bring it back to this year and what people can do, if people are worried about that extra 5% increase they'll be seeing on their bills this year, what can they do? Do you just have to shop around every 12 months?
Yes, you do.
Oh, it's such a chore, though.
It is a chore.
How much money can I save if I go and shop around?
Between $400 and $500 is the answer to that. So we, as you know, we for 25 years, consumers run Powerswitch. It's our free independent price comparison service. We're really proud and passionate about running that service. We've just introduced AI bill reader into that service to make it even easier for people, and we've seen record growth last year. We've seen a massive jump up in people using our service. We had over 1 million users last year. 75% increase year on year, and about 150% increase in people switching. So, that's great that people are doing that. That is a reflection on how many households are struggling, is that they are seeking to save money. The good news is you can save money by changing provider or changing power plan. The real potential for people now is to change the type of plan they're on. And so I'd encourage people to look at that, and that's what's called a time of use plan, and that's where the price of electricity changes throughout the day, and so there's low cost periods. So if you're a household that can shift, your electricity consumption to low cost periods, you can save, typically around 20% fairly readily if you're an electricity household. It's more difficult for households that are on gas, but it's still potential is still there. So in my own case, I'm on time of use plan, and so I've got a rate at night, which is half the price of the peak rate. So I try to sort of do things like charge my EV overnight. I heat my hot water overnight.
Are you vacuuming at 10 p.m, are you?
No, but the big chunks of load in your household are the hot water, EVs, heating, things like that. So anything like that you can move, dishwashers, washing machines, these things are readily, can be moved to low cost periods with minimal impact on your lifestyle. So charging the EV overnight when you're asleep anyway, charging up the hot water overnight for the morning showers, strategies like that. If you're paying half price to do those large chunks of consumption, then you can make considerable savings. So look at my own household. I've got 3 teenage daughters that go through a lot of hot water. So even though my consumption has increased, my overall household costs have been lowered because I'm doing a lot of our consumption, during these very low cost periods when the price of electricity is half price, right? So these are the strategies you can employ. So what we've done on Powerswitch is we've made some investments and put filtering in. So we've got lots of information on time of use, so you can read about it, and we've got some clever graphics and things like that to explain to people how you can strategize to save money in terms of the time of use. And we've also put a filter on the results page, so you can filter by time of use that will show you all those plans, all those retailers that offer time of use as an option. So it's bad for consumers in terms of prices going up, but there are some strategies that consumers can employ to actually offset those costs. We'd rather the government and others intervened. I mean, another thing that we looked at is this is an election year, and so we think energy will be a really hot topic issue. And so our latest surveying showed that 67% of New Zealand consumers want the government to take action. So, you get 60% of the population saying that something needs to be done, politicians will take note of that. Yeah. So this is, cross-party, no matter what sort of where you're on the political spectrum, a common problem that all consumers are seeing is around the price of electricity. So yeah, something needs to be done, but people can take action and lower those costs.
Well, I definitely will be checking it out now that you've told me that it's not such a chore anymore. Thanks so much for joining us, Paul.
No problem. Thank you very much.
That's it for this episode of The Front Page. You can read more about today's stories and extensive news coverage at nzherald.co.nz. The Front Page is hosted and produced by me, Chelsea Daniels. Kane Dickey is our studio operator, Richard Martin, our producer and editor, and our executive producer is Jane Yee. Follow The Front Page on the iHeart app or wherever you get your podcasts, and join us next time for another look beyond the headlines.